we're a very, very deep technical company. So for us, it's like all of this creative work is like it's very far from us. We absolutely admire it, but like unfortunately, there's not a lot of resources for that. But with us in the company, but it is indeed one of the most rewarding things as tools like developer or as someone building tools that creatives can use or other developers can use to see what we enable or what has been built on the platform.
I met a Rick!
Welcome back to another episode of Meta Rick, where we talk about emerging technologies with an emphasis on go-to-market and the business side of things. Talk about spatial computing, Web3, artificial intelligence, and all sorts of fun stuff. Today's guest, we've got Jonathan Hale from Wonderland. Jonathan is attacking, I think, one of the most difficult challenges when it comes to spatial computing and XR, where he's trying to work on the engine level. So an alternative to Unity or Unreal, essentially a gaming engine focused on the WebXR experience. Jonathan's been around the industry for a little while now. We had the chance to meet at AWE, which feels almost like this family reunion for XR experts and people that are out here working in the industry. And we had a chance to run into each other again at CES earlier this year, and nothing but welcoming energy and insights, and always love running into you. So excited to finally get you on the show and be able to share your story with a few folks.
Thank you. Very excited to be here.
Awesome. As we get started, Jonathan, maybe you could start by giving us a little context for what you're working on. So tell us a little bit about what Wonderland is and some of the problems that you're trying to solve with the platform.
So Wonderland is a company that builds Wonderland Engine, which is basically a game engine like Unity or Unreal Engine that gives you the full workflow that you'd expect from such a large engine, but specifically target to the web. And we have real deep optimizations for WebXR, especially or specifically, and a incredibly fast workflow. So you can basically make a change in your editor and kind of within a second see that change appear in your browser, whether that browser is running on your headset, a mobile phone, or a desktop, doesn't really matter. And this way, we're trying to empower developers to use the advantages of the web when building their applications, especially in spatial computing.
It's so important, I think, this idea of accessibility. I work with the in-headset experience of like a native VR application, and there's a lot of friction that comes with not only native VR, but I think all of the XR technology and all these platforms. Like, kids growing up on Roblox and Fortnite is still not the standard demographic of everybody in the world, right? There's still plenty of people that didn't grow up using gaming controllers and understanding how to navigate around these 3D environments. And so I think WebXR fulfills this amazing opportunity to kind of overcome some of that friction, where folks don't necessarily need to put on a headset. They don't necessarily need to have a gaming controller to still be able to access some of the benefits of these 3D spaces. Could you talk to us a little bit about like how you started the company? Like, what made you think, I want to build a gaming engine that supports this kind of WebXR area of the industry?
So I think have always tried to build game engines as a hobby, kind of knowing though that there wasn't like real competitive value to them in a way that you could have commercialized any of them. So I basically just did that as a hobby and interest in the topic. Also, like my studies were focused on computer graphics and all of that. But eventually I ended up founding a agency. We built kind of like AR and VR experiences, also with Unreal Engine and Unity. And kind of like when we discovered that it's possible to do VR on the web, and all our projects were VR already, so we were kind of like in that space, and then figured out, hey, we can actually build kind of websites that then run a VR experience inside them. So you can basically click a button and the website evolves around you, and you can do anything you could do in like a VR application. I realized like, hey, this looks familiar. This is kind of like how Flash games back in the days emerged, and then you had like these. At some point, it was, I think, a $19 billion market of like just free games you could play in the browser. And I was like, hey, this is actually pretty cool. Let's build the first kind of like Flash games website for VR. And so we launched what we back then called Construct Arcade. It's since then been rebranded to HeyVR.io. So if you have a headset, go check out HeyVR.io and play some free VR games. In kind of launching that website, we had to build a bunch of different games ourselves, because obviously if you're a games developer and you see a platform, if it's empty, you're not going to kind of publish to an empty platform, right? And so we built a bunch of the games ourselves. That was Florian and I, my co-founder for that agency. And so we built those games with various frameworks like 3JS, A-Frame, even Unity, like using Unity's HTML5 export and these kind of things. And we realized that none of these frameworks actually give you the power that we were used to from Unreal Engine and Unity. So even like Unity was really, really hard to work with on the web. And for us, that meant like to have this space really take off in a way, we need an engine that is specifically tailored to kind of WebXR and running high performance graphics on the web. And so kind of like two of my passions came together there, with like VR and wanting to build this platform, but also like having built game engines as a hobby in the past. And finally, there was like a actual commercial kind of like fit, or a market fit, where people would actually need this engine because it was so specialized and tailored for this specific use case. And so I set out kind of like building the first lines of code for Wonderland Engine. Kind of like designing it around all of the kind of performance gotchas we learned from building those kind of like, I don't know how many games it was, but that kind of like all the optimizations we kind of learned from that kind of went into Wonderland Engine, such that other developers could just like out of the box have amazing performance and have a workflow that is similar to those you'd find in Unity or Unreal Engine.
So there's two themes I'm picking up on that I really like. One of them is that as industries mature, think about like a CRM software for like a sales team, like a tool like Salesforce or HubSpot. Like there's these like one or two big winners in that space, and they're kind of a catch-all CRM for any sales team, any marketing team, any go-to-market team can use those CRMs, and they're like the industry standards. But then the industry evolves so much that you end up having sales teams that are so niche to all of these different use cases and all of these different industries, where you need a CRM specifically for medical sales folks that focus on working with medical clients. And you need a CRM that's actually not even business related. It's personally like a personal networking CRM. And you end up branching out into these kind of subcategories of that market. And I think gaming engines are kind of getting to that point, right? Like Unreal and Unity are like the two big catch-all systems that get used for kind of everything. But then you have things like Eighth Wall that support getting augmented reality off the ground a little bit quicker. And you've got these automotive configurators that just specialize in building car configurators for automotive websites. And so where you're fitting in is this WebXR category of being able to build a gaming engine optimized for that specific type of developer or that specific use case. Can you talk us a little bit through what exactly WebXR is? Because I think that a lot of the folks that listen to this might know, but the reality is it's a term that I don't think I've taken the time to really fully define out myself. I think of some platforms like Spatial or, Mozilla Hub's RIP that they just kind of, I believe, are sunsetting or shutting that down. But these kind of accessible platforms built on the web where you can jump in VR and in a browser. But maybe you could add a little bit of color to exactly what WebXR is.
All right. So before I specify WebXR, I just wanted to clarify that Wonderland also does like just general 3D on the web. So that car configurator that you spoke about, we could do as well. We have a project actually where we're working on one of those, for example. But so WebXR is effectively, very technically, an API that allows web pages in the browser to access the input coming from an VR device or AR kind of tracking on your phone, and allows you to display images back to that device. So if you're running a browser in the Meta Quest, for example, the WebXR device API is responsible for receiving the images you're kind of rendering with, for example, WebGL or WebGPU, and then displaying those on the screens of the headset. And it's also responsible for taking the input from the controllers or maybe from hand tracking and inputting that to your website such that it can render hands or kind of process the input of the user. And WebXR then, as a more general term, is used to define any application that runs in a website that may be VR or AR enabled. So like maybe VR game or training or effectively any VR app that you could imagine building in Unity or Unreal Engine, you might as well just build on the web. And the advantage of that is that it's super accessible, as in you just input a link, as you mentioned. Like it's kind of like Zoom. You just get a link, you hop right in the browser. You could either use your VR headset or your mobile phone or your desktop, and that brings me to the second huge advantage, and that is that it's cross-platform. So you just build one application, and it could run on any device if you design the UX specifically for each device. And I think that makes it one of the kind of big factors for VR applications to succeed today, because especially marketing agencies or agencies using kind of like VR or XR for advertising will want to reach the biggest or broadest target audience possible in most cases, except maybe when marketing a VR game or something. But if usually the idea is you want to reach as many people as possible, not everyone has a VR headset, or let's say most people don't have a VR headset. And so you can still provide that fallback while being like super hip and kind of like on the cutting edge, supporting XR. You can have people try it out in VR, but you can still support mobile phones as a fallback and reach billions of people in the world.
So it seems like there's this balance between I like this accessibility idea. I think especially like you touched on marketing use cases, it's really important. Because if you want to get as many eyeballs on something as possible, then you need something that's really scalable, really frictionless, really accessible. Whereas like native VR applications might be able to go a little deeper for like niche things where you're trying to engage with like a smaller audience in a really, really deeply immersive way for that little group. So it's like a different need, a different use case. But you also touched on something that I don't want to just go past. I don't want to forget about this. So you mentioned that you also can do these car configurators and fully web-based experiences as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be connected to a VR or AR connection. It can be, but there's also this just purely web-based 3D world building concept as well. What percentage of the experiences that you're building or that are on your platform in general from your developers would you say are focused primarily on a web experience versus being focused on that web connection into VR?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really interesting question, because we emerged from WebXR kind of like originally setting out to, hey, WebXR requires a lot more in terms of performance, because you have a stereo kind of rendering left and right eye, very high kind of like resolutions and high frame rates, versus a phone is kind of like, okay, maybe 30 or to 60 frames per second and like full HD rendering a single kind of target. And that's pretty comparatively easy. Let's say you have a lot more time to do the rendering compared to like stereo 90 or 120 hertz. And that meant that the performance was kind of like one of those things that was almost not possible to achieve on the web, because unfortunately, historically, WebGL has been kind of seen as this very slow API where it's really, really hard to get performant rendering out of it. I believe we've kind of proven that that's not true. And if you use WebGL in the right way, you can actually get native matching performance on the web for rendering. But like coming back around to the question, most of our users like have a perfect fit with Wonderland because of like the VR use case. So they need that excellent performance, and that's why they basically don't have a choice apart from Wonderland Engine. Whereas on the web, you still need performance, like on web without XR, to clarify. You still need performance, and especially on iOS, it is really hard to achieve that performance through the browser. And so you might still find companies or developers interested in Wonderland Engine for the performance aspects on those platforms. But generally, it's a little bit easier to get the performance on those devices also because you have more budget, because you're rendering at mono and lower frame rates and these kind of things. And so because our match is so high with VR, I would say probably 95% of developers or something are coming from VR, and kind of like a lot of them are also from entertainment, kind of because there's a lot of kind of match with entertainment and VR at the moment with the Meta Quest and so on.
That
But
makes a
those
lot of
are
sense because
very
I feel like
rough numbers.
I feel like that's where the biggest problem is, right? Like being able to connect that web-based developed product to that VR experience through a web-based build. That's really tricky. And building an engine that can optimize that, there's a huge opportunity to solve big problems there. That same engine happens to work really well for the web, but there's probably, I'd imagine, a lot more alternatives if you're just building for the web and like you don't need that XR connection. They've just like that's been around a while. To your point, it's part of what sparked you to even come into this world. What one thing I was thinking about too. So you talked earlier about some optimizations that your platform leans on, right? Like this is why people are coming to you versus a Unity or an Unreal or one of these bigger platforms when they want to build WebXR tools or games or experiences. What are some of those optimizations? Like, what are some of the flaws you noticed in the bigger gaming engines that your team is solving for?
Okay, so I think like comparing to the bigger game engines is kind of like always a little bit unfair because they are built for native, where you download applications, for example, on Steam or on the Play Store or the App Store, and you kind of like have 5 minutes or something to download the entire application. Then it's like 200 to like 2 gigabytes, 3 gigabytes, maybe even more, right? And then you start the game and you kind of like have this super fast connection to your hard drive rather than having to stream everything over the internet. And that's just a completely different approach to how you build the application. And so most of those bigger gaming engines, if or native engines that support web, um, will kind of like have this backwards approach of kind of like trying to download everything up front and then starting the application, rather than starting the application as soon as possible to kind of like give the user like the first menus or something to interact with as soon as possible, and then like kind of avoiding the user possibly dropping off because he didn't expect to spend like 5 minutes to wait on the application. And it's also the kind of like web APIs for graphics, like WebGL 2, for example, have very specific performance characteristics that distinguish it very much from the native APIs that Unity and Unreal use under the hood. That might be OpenGL or Vulkan and Metal and kind of like these native graphics APIs. So kind of you would need to write the engine in a slightly different way and the rendering engine in a slightly different way for them kind of to be able to compete on kind of the performance level. Uh, Unfortunately, because it's kind of like one of the platforms that they kind of also support, and it's like a chicken and the egg problem, right? Because their web support isn't great, there isn't a lot of users using it or making a bunch of money on it, so they don't have incentive to actually like invest more time into that and like trying to figure out why it's not performing. And apart from like by design the engine not being really compatible with the web mentality or web design of building an application, it's also just they're not interested enough to actually invest as much time. You see that there's like some Unity is spending a little bit of time like trying to get web GPU support and all these kind of things, but I can the resources that they should be spending is like on a completely different level
Yeah,
that's not even
when
that
these
they're not
companies
considering.
when these companies get so big like this, like they end up having their core business and like their main focal points, and then a lot of these features become like the ugly stepchild of the company and like just don't get
Yeah,
enough
exactly.
attention. They don't get enough love, and there's plenty of developers that are longing for those tools and like want to build on it, but they just don't have the resource from those core platforms. And as I'm hearing you describe the technology, it makes me curious about something. So I've had a lot of experience with spatial. I used to host a lot of my meetings in spatial, both in VR and on the browser. And so I'm pretty familiar with that platform. That's probably when I think of WebXR, it's one of the first things I think of as far as like an experience platform. But it sounds like the way they work is they have like a Unity SDK, right? Where a lot of folks are building in Unity and then kind of porting those experiences into spatial as the interface where users can then come and interact with those worlds and environments. But your platform seems like it's a little different, right? Like you guys aren't porting worlds from Unity into the platform. And forgive me, I'm a words guy. I'm not as technical, so I might be explaining this question horribly. But I'm curious what the workflow is differently with a platform like yours versus something like Spatial that's kind of leaning on a bigger engine to support their platform.
I think the the word platform kind of might like raise a bit of confusion, so I'll kind of like specify here that spatial basically as a platform, like it hosts the applications, right? And Wonderland Engine as a platform is more like for the developer a platform to build on, but they receive all of the files to run the application as the output of what they built, and they can host it wherever they want. So they are in control of the application versus in spatial's case, which, by the way, I'm not as familiar with. So I hope what
Fair,
I'm saying
fair.
is not completely off. But as far as I understand, it's basically a browser for spatial apps, as in spatial, the company apps, which is also very confusing.
Oh
So
yeah, because they also
it's
do
a
have
slightly,
apps too, huh? I forgot about
yeah.
that.
I
They
mean,
also do install apps as well. But um, so okay, so I think something like Spatial might actually be like almost like a customer of you guys, right? Or almost like a channel where
exactly.
people would
Yeah, that's actually a
build
very good way to put it. Yeah,
using your engine and then host in something like a Spatial as like the interface to access the things people build in your engine.
exactly.
D-
Yeah. So the the developers, it's like if you can replace, if they use Unity, they could be replacing Unity with Wonderland Engine, and that kind of like that's the big difference. The output is then an application that could again be a platform. So you could build platforms on top of Wonderland Engine, even like user-generated content platforms, where then users build other applications and worlds inside that platform that you built with Wonderland Engine. So it's like it's just a very general purpose development tool compared to like a how I guess how, like a content platform, maybe you could call it. I don't know,
mm.
or an app platform. This is more like a developer platform, as in we provide to developers a platform to build upon. Yeah, okay, that
Yeah,
doesn't really clarify it much, to be honest. But
I think the metaphor that works for me, just and it's totally selfishly, this is how my brain works, right? Is I think about how I can understand it, and then hopefully that's helpful to somebody. Is I would use YouTube as a comparison, right? So like YouTube
Mhm.
hosts video content and is this interface for people to browse and access video content, and creators can create their channels and upload and curate their libraries to put out to their audience. But they're not making videos on YouTube. They're not editing those videos on YouTube. They're making those videos with a camera and then editing them in Premiere and then uploading those to
Mhm.
YouTube. And so the game developer scenario is similar, right? Where they're going to be building 3D files in Blender that's kind of like capturing the video content with a camera. Then they're going to be developing the game in Wonderland, kind of like editing the video in Premiere. And then they'll upload that to some sort of an interface, whether that's a library within some sort of a pre-built browser of games, or if that's something like on a device like a Meta Quest device or something like that. But that's more like the YouTube comparison of where that content ends up living and being interacted with by a user. I think
Exactly,
that starts to
that's
track,
spot
at
on.
least
Yeah.
for me. Did you find that to be helpful?
Absolutely, and I think the if you like the YouTube of WebXR is probably then HeyVR that I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned before, like the browser games platform. So if you're building a game, and as opposed to maybe an enterprise training, a museum kind of experience, educational experience, just to differentiate those. If you're building a game with Wonderland Engine, you could then upload that to HeyVR, and kind of like people would then go to HeyVR, play those games, and that's kind of brings the entire ecosystem in.
Totally. I feel like we got really, really tactical pretty early. I have a tendency to do this. I think this is a phrase I've said on almost every podcast I've hosted is like, we got too tactical. Let's zoom out a little bit. Because one of the things I'm really curious about when I met you at CES, when we had this chat about your story, one of the things that I got really interested in is the founding story, like how you went about building a company. It's something I'm really passionate about. I've almost exclusively worked for startups, going from either 0 to 1 or 1 to 10 is kind of the range where I usually fit in. And so selfishly, I get really curious about how founders go from 0 to 1. How do they create something? And so maybe we could talk a little bit about, okay, not just how you got interested. Like, we know you played a lot of games and developed these. You were developing engines kind of for fun before finding a business for it. But how did you actually go about turning this into a company? Like, I recruiting that first person to work with you. Did you raise money? Is it all bootstrapped? Like, let's talk through a little bit about how you actually brought the idea to life.
Okay, so I think first and foremost, this was driven by my passion around kind of productivity and game engine tech. So for one, like my entire life, I've just been watching all the super deep dive technical GDC or SIGGRAPH talks, just being interested in like how do people manage to render like more amounts of polygons in a more beautiful way, and like multi-thread, like all the stuff that kind of goes into engines, even asset management tooling, all of that. In parallel, I've been like super fascinated with like how can I build faster, and like how can I make myself more productive, build the same kind of software or applications, even like general purpose software. Like a very long time ago, I built like a fitness studio management tool for a good friend. How could I build like this software faster to kind of like build, like just be more productive, have more output in the same amount of time. Um, and for me, kind of like it clicked at some point with Wonderland Engine, where I was realizing that by design, like just by having a different foundation than most like other engines or frameworks or tools out there, I could build a significantly better product that would be more fun to work with, and would kind of be able to outperform like everything with given amount of time, right? It's kind of like um, the if you see it as a curve, like kind of like a logarithmic curve, the output per time you would be able to achieve with Wonderland Engine at some point would probably like flatten out, but it would be flattening out above everything else significantly. So the question is just like, how fast can we get to that curve to actually build the startup and all these kind of things, right? But by design, I found something that I knew could be better given just enough time that we kind of like worked on it. And so I kind of like found myself to use that as my daily motivation to just kind of continue working on that. And I've kind of bootstrapped Wonderland Engine for the first couple of years. Kind of back in 2018 was kind of like the inception of the idea when we launched Construct Arcade, which is now Haviar. And then kind of like wrote the first lines of code, trying to like prove technically some assumptions that I had. Then I like legally officially founded the company in 2020, to then have the first public version in September 2020, I believe. And then shortly after that, we kind of like had the first um, people like purchasing our subscription based model that we like quickly like kind of like just scrapped and decided like, well, this is nice, we're getting like some early revenue, so to speak, but let's grow the community instead, to because I believe one of the big foundational pieces of any development tool is having a big, helpful, great community that is there to also support other projects with kind of the work that they build in open source, and kind of like sharing the knowledge, and also providing a form of kind of marketing for the development tool with the kind of great stuff they build. So for us, it was like, okay, let's kind of like it. Kind of, we were able to prove there's interest in the engine. That's great. Now let's make it free, and then we kind of like switch business models to a royalty based model where you kind of have a cap and you can use it for free to like a certain amount of revenue per year, and that allowed the community to grow a bit faster, which I still think was an absolutely great idea. But we kind of in this time also found like our first really large partner that we worked with, and that allowed us then in I believe it was early 2021. Is that correct? Might be 2022. I'm currently blanking on that. But like
COVID
we
like
raised a
combined
seed
3
round.
years. I feel like 3 years just blended together in the middle there somewhere with,
Yeah,
with COVID and everything going on.
yeah.
But
But
so you
oh yeah,
guys you
so
guys
you
raised around.
yeah, but before that, actually, I was able to hire the first employee on Wonderland Engine, which was a freelancer that I worked with earlier, and then kind of like realized like I need to hire this guy because he's so good, and just like I had so incredible luck, kind of like finding him as a super reliable developer who was able to I could just tell him to work on something and he would do the job better than I would, and that is like something where like I'm a little bit more hasty in my work. So if I build stuff, I might just like merge some code with various types of bugs, but like it would be a big challenge to find bugs in his code because he's just so incredibly due diligent, and that made him like super valuable because kind of like I don't know, I could just rely on the code that he produced, and it was absolutely incredible.
That's
And
huge.
he
I mean,
shared the same passions.
that's a big mistake a lot of founders and early stage companies make is that first development hire or how they go about developing the early stages of the product. I do a lot of advisory work with startups, not as much now, but I used to do more advisory work before Arthur, and very tight in that founder community and talk to people about this stuff all the time. And it seems like there's this pattern where a lot of startups that fail early on, where they fail around like Series A, Series B range,
Hmm.
they offshore way too much, way too early, and they don't get like a real serious developer or CTO type or even a technical advisor, like someone to really help with the development early. And that
Mhm.
tech debt, that lack of architecture and thoughtful coding in those first 2 to 5 years almost always causes you to rebuild the platform from scratch by the time you raise money. And then it basically
Yeah.
sets you back 2 years, and it really makes it hard to get from that initial proof of concept to where you want to go. Versus if you build a proof of concept the right way, you get this developer you can really rely on. You can just take that proof of concept and keep building on top of it and not lose that momentum. So I think that's really good you were able to do that. One of
Yeah,
the
I
things
believe I got really lucky on that.
one of the things that stood out to me is this idea that you pivoted from the monetization model to the community forward kind of product led growth model. Super, super interesting. So that must have felt amazing to get that validation that like, oh, someone is willing to pay for this thing that I made. That's like number one thing of like, I built a business. Like this is a real business. It feels like it's a real business. Like that probably was a huge moment in the company. When you pivoted to the community forward model, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on a little bit about the reasoning, but more so like, how did you build that community? Like, was it all organic? People just word of mouth talking about it? Did you go to online forums? Did you go to in-person events? Like, how did you go about fostering that initial developer community when you were building that?
Yeah, so it was all organic because effectively, as I mentioned, we have this extremely good fit with WebXR as like kind of like the only engine that really spends the time to optimize the performance for WebXR specifically, and it's kind of obvious why most frameworks don't do that because it's like WebXR, especially back in those days, was extremely niche. And but I believe that maybe 10, 15 years from now, any VR, AR, spatial computing application, probably like more than 50% of all of the applications built will be web-based, just because I believe the web is a better development platform. Alone just because of the cross-platform nature of it. Like, you build one application, it runs everywhere. But also for like many other reasons, from like not having to go through app stores, like keeping all the revenue, and all of these kind of like many different factors that you get on the web. Um, um, but yeah, so we had a lot of organic growth just from people like Googling WebXR performance, because they tried to build a WebXR application, realized that, well, the performance wasn't that amazing. And then kind of like we had very before I wrote the first lines of code, I literally launched a website that was kind of like describing how Wonderland Engine is like optimizing for all of that, because I basically had it planned out in my head already, and I knew what I would be able to do. I started collecting like newsletter subscribers since then. Mm, that gave us some nice Google karma, like, because we did that so early. But yeah, so it
So
was all
that's
organic.
really cool. So the newsletter thing is really common at this like building in public idea. Like the newsletter model is almost converted into the LinkedIn model now, right? Is this idea of the founder posting and talking about it. Same idea though, right? It's like the founder sharing stories and his mindset on what he's building. And then people see that, whether that's a newsletter with subscribers and building SEO, or that's LinkedIn or Reddit. Like there's all these different channels that founders build in public now. What were did any of those newsletters like seem to stand out to you, as far as like when you look back? Is there like a particular theme or topic that like really sparked a lot of interest, or like was one of the more popular or well received kind of notes that you
So
shared with the world?
Um, so to clarify, I collected newsletter emails, but I can't really say that I used that properly. So, like, despite we having a couple emails, like a nice list back then, I didn't actually like send a lot of emails out. So it could have probably, I bet there might have even been a 12-month kind of like span of time where there wasn't even a single email sent, because especially in the early days I was just like head down focused on coding so much, because to get a game engine to kind of an initial usable state, kind of at the technical level that we are building it, is really really difficult. And therefore it was just so much work to get to that first version that that was usable. And like I really appreciate Florian at this point, who was kind of like always during development our first user trying to build WebXR games or WebVR games back in the day, with Wonderland Engine, because he kind of like understood why. But it was a lot of a lot of struggle back then, especially the first version. Like the first versions before we did our first public version was so crashy that you basically had to like Control S, like save all the time, because it would just like you might just hit a button and then it would like poof be gone.
Yeah, it's, I
And
mean, it's a big product, right? Like there's all of these products where like a founder can like move to Bali, build a company completely on their own, and like spin up a product in 24 hours that they can put out to
yeah,
the world and then just start iterating every week. This is not one of those products, right? Like a gaming engine is it's a big undertaking to just get it to a place where developers can even log in and start creating things with it. So that makes a
yeah.
lot of sense to me that you started heads down. It was like build the thing first. But it's also kind of crazy. Like you must have found, yeah, like you this really validates the initial idea, right? Because you were so right about the problem and focusing on the product that you found such a strong product market fit, where that organic community developing could really be led by the product, and not something where you had to do a lot of marketing or a lot of community outreach to get people interested. That's something really special. Now that you have the community, has that changed? Is there like a community development or marketing approach that you guys have now that's kind of shifted as the company has now raised a little bit of money and evolved a little bit?
Yeah, so kind of we raised that pre-seed or seed round to get the product into a production ready state or a market ready state. And we achieved that last year with our 1.0 release in May. So basically our kind of like growth focus was like mostly just on like getting the product in that state and like partnering with a couple of companies to build like really amazing use cases. And we recently released like two or even a couple of very notable experiences like the Escape Artist with Paradowski Creative. So they built this escape room game for WebXR, which even runs on the Apple Vision Pro now, and uh, it's it's incredible. You cannot distinguish it from like a native MetaQuest 3 title. It's like it's absolutely beautiful just from the art, the narrative, and the UX is so incredibly polished. So like it's free. Just go check it out. It's esc.art, like esc.art, and just open it on your Quest 3. We also ported a Unity like literal native MetaQuest 3 game that's published to the store. Um, and we ported that to Wonderland Engine to run it on the web to demonstrate that it runs at exactly the same performance as it did as the native application. And then we have Archery Evolution, and just recently, Visual Lights, a game developer also like building for VR, launched Robot Arena, and so we partnered with a couple of companies to build these kind of like bigger showcases to show what the web is capable of now. Uh, and just recently, we started reaching out to companies for like more enterprisey kind of like use cases, whether that is this car configurator or kind of like trainings, education, maybe museum experiences is very popular because you have someone coming into the museum, they want to try the experience or use the experience, but they might not install an app just for their one visit, right? And there's some really nice fits with the web there.
Yeah,
So
I think
that's kind of like our focus shifted there in the last couple of months. But we're literally just reaching out to people that have been following, like for example, on LinkedIn for a while, and just kind of trying to um, talk to people that are already kind of like aware of Wonderland Engine and kind of figure out what are they working on, are they interested in like building something with Wonderland Engine and so on.
I think there's something really special about when you build these marketplaces where like your tool is supporting developers, right? Developers are incredible. Developers are building things that the rest of us get to use. There's something really special about this idea of creation, and you're enabling creation. You're helping developers take their ideas and make the best version of them using your development tool, using this engine. And so I feel like in your marketing and like the content you get to share and celebrate, it's not so much about the technical requirements or the details of the engine. It's more, this is the output that developers can create using our engine. And so you get to really put a spotlight on some incredible development work and people that are really using your product, right? So I think there's something exciting about that. And I think that's a good approach. When it comes to these partners, are most of these folks that found you, started building, and then you engaged with them as developers that were on the platform? Are these folks that you did outreach to or found on your own? Or talk me through a little bit of the journey of how you connect with one of these bigger development partners, and
Mhm.
kind of the process from starting the conversation to the marketing and putting out a project like that.
So effectively, we started looking in the WebXR community. Paradowski Creative, for example, had built a WebXR game, WebXR mini golf game before, and they kind of like got pretty successful with that. So we already knew that they were like familiar with WebXR. They like did an amazing job, especially creatively. And I mean, we're a very deep technical company, so for us, it's like. All of this creative work is like it's very far from us. We absolutely admire it, but like unfortunately, there's not a lot of resources for that. But with us in the company, um, but it is indeed one of the most rewarding things as tools like developer or as someone building tools that creatives can use or other developers can use to see what we enable or what has been built on the platform. um, and like I'm just like super impressed with with the entire like Wonderland community. We might release a Wonderland reel for 2023 this year again. So we'll have like a neat little show reel showing off like a lot of the like uh, apps that we had that have been built with Wonderland Engine. So I'm looking forward to that because it exactly again like highlights what you say, like being able to spotlight what has been possible or what developers were able to do is like so I think also one of our jobs, or like
Hmm.
obviously also like it's great for us, great for them.
Do you see yourselves kind of, because it's very similar to the Unreal model, right? Where it's like the royalty, where people can try for free, then they have a certain threshold, and then they pay a percentage out once they reach a certain threshold. But then, Epix has done this really incredible thing with their business model of having their own gaming studio where they build games on top of their own engine. Sounds like you started with a bit of that chicken and the egg, like you needed some content already on the platform or built with the engine to get people to build on the engine. Then they have the stock library of where the creators and the developers on their platform can go to that library and pull a lot of assets from stock. And then they've got the actual engine, and it all kind of like feeds on each other, right? And so I'm wondering if that's in your model. Do you have kind of a stock marketplace or partnering up with like a Sketchfab or TurboSquid or something? For those unfamiliar, those are like 3D asset stock sites. Do you imagine kind of branching out into these other areas as well?
So we, in our upcoming 1.2 version of Wonderland Engine, will have a plugin API for the editor. So integrations with Sketchfab, for example, are going to be really, really simple to do. And I believe that a marketplace for developers to exchange their work is extremely important, and you can probably extrapolate from there. And therefore, at the moment, we don't have a marketplace, but what might be in the future. Uh, I, one I think important distinction to make to Unreal Engine's business model is yes, we do also have royalty and the cap, but a lot of companies, it turns out, are not very happy with like sharing revenue, even if it's
Mm.
just on projects built with Wonderland Engine. So we do offer an alternative seated license that developers can purchase, which is more similar to what Unity offers with their pro licenses, except that then you don't have a runtime fee. But yeah, so
That's
just for
that.
people that are listening and might be like, "Hey, I really want to use this, but royalty, that's not."
Oh yeah. It's hard. Pricing's really hard. When building a company, it's again, I've only almost exclusively helped small companies sell to big companies, and pricing's always a challenge to figure out the right model that really really works. Product market fit's the most important thing. It sounds like you have that in like a really strong way. Monetizing that product market fit without losing that great relationship with customers is just, it's tricky. It's really tricky to get right because so many different people are subjective and have their own preferences on, oh, I'm totally okay with royalty versus, oh, I'd rather have a per seat model. And so I empathize with how tricky that can be. But you said something earlier that I wanted to kind of double click on that I hadn't thought about until you said it. Is you said something about avoiding the app store. Like when you have a WebXR application, like when you have this tool built on the web, you no longer need to put that app in a marketplace that can be bought, downloaded, installed, and then you throw your 30% commission to iOS or whatever. That's a sticky subject right now. The Epic and Apple lawsuit, the Epic and Google lawsuit, like this is something that is very top of mind for people in the community. Do you see WebXR as an alternative that just completely avoids that 30% fee? Is that because I think that's really under talked about? I haven't really heard anyone bring that up. And maybe that's just me being ignorant, not being in those circles as much, but I'm wondering how big that is in your talk track or in your focus for the future.
Um, so there's still a lot of discussion going uh, around monetization of WebXR applications. So the idea is you can easily monetize, for example, with Google Ads, just like put ads on your page before you enter the VR mode. You can have ads in your experience. For example, Zesty Market is offering kind of like that as an ad network. You can, of course, just like get a credit card with like Google Pay or something like that. With web payments, there's like an API the browser offers to take payments easily. Um, and most of these like don't incur any like additional like platform fees, which is great. The kind of upfront purchase and then kind of go into the experience is a little bit, let's say, rare. I think one very interesting business model that uh, HoverFit has, which is a application by the Fitness Resort. They basically built this really cool experience where you can like kind of stand on a hoverboard and then you do squats to kind of like propel the hoverboard forward. And if you play it multiplayer, it's like hilariously fun. And I do go to the gym, but after one session of like I don't know like 5 to 10 minutes with one of the developers, I was like, oh God, I really feel my legs now. And I didn't like it was just like fun to do the experience, and I wasn't focusing on the kind of exercise aspect of it. Um, but that's HooverFit, and you can play it for free right now, especially since it's like kind of like in a alpha beta stage. Play it on HeyVR, so go to heyvr.io and enter HooverFit, and their kind of end goal, as I believe possibly it is still right now, might still change, is to have a kind of subscription model to lock some of the content behind, uh, like behind a paywall, so to speak. But there's going to always be some kind of foundational core content that you can try out for free. And I think it's important in the web, you have super low friction to get people into the experience. So you should use that low friction to show them what they could have. And then you can kind of like take that momentum and potentially convert that into a subscription or a one-time payment or something like that. I haven't seen that like done in WebXR yet, and that is especially where kind of like these platform fees would kind of like make the big difference, where all of a sudden you have 30% more revenue compared to if you had released that app on the store. And I know that most people right now are thinking like, oh, but if I don't release in a store, then I don't get distribution. But the thing with the store distribution is like most content on the store isn't found through searches, but through like inputting the exact name of that um, application into the search field, right? So if like you look for Beat Saber, right, you'll like find Beat Saber probably through YouTube or maybe a website or something like that, and you'll input Beat Saber and you'll download Beat Saber. You're not gonna look for lightsaber slicing game or something like that. Maybe you have a list like top 10 games, but it's probably not likely that you're going to be one of the top 10 games. So the distribution really only helps the already successful in those cases. And I believe that distribution argument for the app stores is kind of a non-argument in most cases. So I do believe that saving those 30% at the moment with the current app stores is a net win for anyone listening right now,
It
probably.
it seems huge. Like the monetization on the building process it's fair. It makes sense. Like you're using this amazing engine to build incredible things. Like if you're painting, you're going to pay for canvases and paints and brushes, right? Like you need to invest in the resources that let you build the incredible experiences and incredible art that you build. But the distribution piece of it is interesting because it's like we all have phones, we all have access to the web. Like I think YouTube is like a really great comparison, right? Like you can pay to avoid ads or for value added services, but you're paying the platform for that. I guess they take a percentage from creators and distribution there too, but it's interesting. I think this is a subject that's going to keep evolving because the creator economy is only getting bigger and bigger. Like kids used to want to be astronauts, now they want to be YouTubers and TikTokers and game developers,
Right.
right? And so I think we're going to keep seeing this pivot. Something I keep thinking about as we talk about this, because I remember I used to play a lot of these web-based games too, and I'm thinking about like Club Penguin, right? The metaverse that is lost into the past that sold to Disney for hundreds of millions of dollars. But then there's also things like cartoonnetwork.com, which I remember as a kid, that was like one of the coolest things is like playing Codename Kids Next Door and Ben 10 and like Dexter's Laboratory, like all these games in a browser that were all my favorite shows. It was all my favorite IP in these little, just kind of cheaply made, dumb games. They weren't anything intricate or incredible. And now we're seeing that happen a lot with Fortnite and Roblox, right? Where people are building, trying to go to those spaces. But I wonder how much untapped opportunity there is with building similar experiences that are maybe a little bit more dumbed down, but fully owned by the brand and built using an engine like yours, and then just putting it out on the web, versus building within those ecosystems of Roblox or Fortnite. Do you have any thoughts on, like, for a brand, like what the advantage would be to building on like an existing ecosystem versus building with your engine and building their own ecosystem?
I think you already hinted at it. It's like being able to own the application and kind of like keep ownership over the IP. If um, you kind of like have full control over when you want to release, where you want to release. You send people to your platform rather than kind of like being on a third party platform that you're kind of like giving a lot of value to by having your IP on their platform, right? And then you're also paying 30% of your revenues for being on that platform and giving that value, unless you get like a special deal from those app stores. Um, so I think another kind of like advantage for brands who are mostly interested or often interested in kind of like reaching the biggest target audience is also that kind of accessibility of being able to fall back from XR also into like mobile and desktop, right? And then uh, I guess on Meta Quest, it's really interesting because on WebXR there's a surprising amount of traffic. So there's I think a huge untapped potential there, where especially if you're building like a smaller game, you could just like market test with kind of like smaller games you release either on HVR or by yourself or however you want to like publish your game. Um, and then kind of like getting that featured in, for example, Volvic or the MetaQuest browser, um, and then you'll be surprised of how many people will actually like play that game. And the kind of session duration, for example, is a very good indicator for like how engaging your game is and whether people are returning to the game and all of that before you maybe invest like $1 million budget into like a full VR native title or something like that. And then, in my opinion, if you like the developer experience of WebXR, which I almost guarantee you will, you might even be interested in putting that budget into a web game instead and trying to innovate a bit on that model, because that
Yeah,
allows you to support any VR headset, not just that one.
I think this is a, it is really clicking for me the more I talk to you about what you're building and like getting your take on this WebXR space. Like, I think a lot of brands instinctually hear about things like spatial and then they kind of go that route. The reality is, like, when I scroll through spatial, there's not that many daily active users in those spaces, at least the public facing ones. Some of the private ones and then the one day activations, they get a lot of traffic for sure. But the ongoing public facing spaces, you can scroll through their site and you're going to see like 3 people, 8 people. Like, it's very little, tiny groups, and maybe there's 100 users that you'll see kind of scrolling through it. I've checked a lot, just because I'm super curious about it. But for a brand that has IP, they have an audience, they have a following, I imagine you could spin something up a lot more cost effectively and a lot more timely using something like Wonderland, and then also open up that door to VR so that you can be building in the ecosystem for Meta and for Apple and for HTC, for all of these vendors out here that are consumer focused, and be able to do that in a way where you don't have to necessarily go all in on VR, or all in on like a PS5 console game or PC game. This is interesting. I don't think there's enough brands doing this. Like, I really don't see
Me
headlines
neither.
about this ever. Yeah, it's interesting. It's really clicking for me. I'm definitely going to be doing more research into this. I'm super curious about it. There's one other question that I just like feel obligated to ask you before we get close to wrapping up here soon. But AI, everyone's talking about AI, right? It's like AI and the metaverse. There's this weird story going that they're competing with each other in some way or form. I think it's ridiculous. It's so silly. Like they build on top of each other. They help each other.
Absolutely.
The only way that they compete is for budgets and for attention. Like the headlines, right? Like the eyeballs that go to one or the other. In that nature, they're
Mhm.
competitive. But I think AI is an amazing enabler for everything, for literally everything, like generative AI tools like ChatGPT or their recent announcement with Sora, what they're doing with video generation. Midjourney's obviously gotten a lot of attention. How are you guys experimenting with AI, either as a feature of the engine or as like an internal process or an internal tool?
So I basically Wonderland Engine is very core focused on kind of like our rendering technology. So I was always hesitant of kind of like touching a very very fast moving space like generative AI or like any form of kind of like AI in general. Um, so with our kind of upcoming plugin uh, API that allows kind of like any developer to just extend our editor as they want, I think we have finally the opportunity to make use of all of these kind of like new advancements in terms of especially like generating materials or meshes from text basically and kind of integrating that directly into the editor that you can basically have a text field right there and then just like say, well, I want uh, I don't know, mesh of a duck, and it's supposed to have a rubber duck kind of texture and material and feel to it, or something like that. I don't know. And then I also seen a lot of experiments in the community for especially like AI teachers. Like just you can like ask kind of a teacher like some question and it like goes off to ChatGPT, does some like did some like voice to text before and then sends the text off and then like comes back with a response and then text to voice back out to the user, and that makes it a very very natural interface to kind of like converse with characters inside call it a metaverse, maybe a game experience, training applications, all of that. It's basically uh, like chat gpt but more of a natural gpt if you want, like just a way to interact or an interface for ai that is maybe even more convenient, and may even be like contextually based, like inside a game world or something like that. And I think that there's companies working on especially getting the latency down there, because I think the way we're conversing right now is kind of like very kind of like you just like start talking once I stop, right? With these kind of like ChatGPT prompts, it could take a couple of seconds before the kind of like other speaker reacts to what you're saying. But um, I think the latency is getting to a point where it's kind of like extremely natural to converse with AIs inside WebXR, inside virtual worlds. And typing is really not fun in a VR headset. So I believe that that's gonna be like a huge win once we get there.
I think so first of all, you're absolutely right. The way that people talk is so interesting. Like when we watch TV shows, one of the biggest lies on TV is that people wait till the other person's done talking to start talking. Like that's just not how people work. Like it's not great to like be interrupting people all the time. That's super rude. Sometimes I wish I had a personal mute button to stop myself. But I think the way we naturally communicate with each other is like that sparks a thought. I want to say something, and then like we try and find like almost like catching a wave, like our little moments to kind of jump in or add a little bit of our own color to the conversation. It's not this like perfectly scripted start stop type of a thing. And to your point with AI, it is this like you say it, you wait, they respond, and that's getting better and better and better. There's some other things that like I was talking to Steve Grubbs from Victory XR a while ago, and he's been experimenting with this with creating like a Thomas Edison's lab, where Thomas Edison gives you a tour of the lab and you can talk to him and he answers questions about his history, and it's a really engaging way for a student to learn about Thomas Edison. But there's like guide rails that they have to put in place, right? And those guide rails aren't made by ChatGPT or whatever API they pull in for. They have to set guide rails because students are going to ask silly questions, inappropriate ones maybe, and you got to prevent that from happening because it's still like a classroom, right? You need to have your own kind of set of guidelines. Same thing if you wanted to have a virtual Nike store. That Nike employee needs to be trained on the Nike code of conduct, right? So that they can perform the way they would expect one of their employees to perform in a store. And so those guide rails are tricky. I wonder, is any of that stuff that would be related to your engine, or would you imagine that being like a plugin where someone develops the AI stuff separately and just kind of pipes that into the games that they're building inside of Wonderland? Or do you see yourselves focusing on building functionality like that?
No, I don't think we'll get much or deep into building, like especially like conversational AI or anything in that direction. I think we're probably closer to like how can we help developers create content, animations, meshes, textures, all of that inside the editor, and probably using like third-party services, because I don't think we'll be focusing on uh, that to a degree outside of like just the developer experience of how to integrate that easily into the editor. Um, but I mean, absolutely, I think the developers using Wonderland Engine will probably deal with this a lot more. So I wonder if this, I I could see it at least like from a documentation perspective to be something where we're interested in kind of like leading the guidelines around this stuff for our developers. How do you make an AI safe or something? Once we get to a point where that is a little bit more more common to use in Wonderland Engine, maybe because some like party libraries make it possible. Um, but yeah,
That
so I
seems
don't.
that's
I think.
speaking of cutting people off earlier, but that seems like the smart approach to me personally. It's like we only have so many resources to build so many things, and I think focusing on the strengths of your platform and building for the problem you sought to solve, and then let these other tools focus on those niche pieces of the puzzle on their own, and then just find ways to partner up and work with them. Or to your point, as best practices become actual best practices instead of just theories, then you can start to share those things with your community and be a leader without having to necessarily be a developer of those specific tools. I think that's a really smart approach. The other category that might be more aligned, and you might have the same exact answer for this too, is like Blockade Labs. Obviously has gone very viral with some of their skybox generation. I interviewed someone for their team recently as well, and they have this idea of like one-click game development, this ability to kind of give a prompt and create an environment, an ecosystem. And I don't think Azra Games is using them specifically, but when I talked to their CTO, he was talking about they use AI to generate the worlds and then like props and set dressing. They use AI to help, but it's kind of 50-50 on the CPUs and NPC type characters. And then it's almost 100% human development when it comes to main characters and villains and the most emotionally connected, emotionally charged pieces of the story. So there's kind of a spectrum to how they're using AI versus human creativity. And I don't know if internally, like outside of engine features, have you guys been dabbling with any of these prompt-based tools? Is there any workflows in your development process or your creative process, marketing process, any of it, where these tools have become helpful? Or again, underrated answer, but I think it's okay to say no to that. But I'm curious if you guys have been dabbling or using it for anything.
So I think in our personal processes, and most of our developers probably use ChatGPT every now and then to like ask a question to get a random answer, and then in a very educated way evaluate if that answer is actually what you're looking for. So like for example, what we're dealing with a lot is the V8 API, and V8 is a JavaScript runtime by Google. It's also the JavaScript runtime inside of Chrome, for example. Um, and we integrate kind of like Node.js and V8 into the Wonderland editor to like provide very convenient workflows when working with NPM projects. So this is a very complex API, and most of us are not like extremely like expert level like on like overview and understanding of that API. So for example, I use ChatGPT a lot to just like generate code snippets for like how do I do X, Y, and Z with the V8 API, and ChatGPT for some reason knows this stuff because there's a huge amount of documentation out there that probably was used during training for ChatGPT. So like there's maybe a point where we're like more actively using AI, but I couldn't even say that I use it daily. But also, I don't get to develop daily anymore, so um, I
Actually,
guess.
that leads
Uh,
to a kind of a different topic, not to totally switch subjects, but um, that's a big thing, right? Like when you're founding the company, the beginning stage is pretty much heads down coding almost the whole time,
mhm.
right? Like you're just trying to build. Now that you've matured a little bit and you've got a team around you, where is your time spent the most? Like what are the main things that you're focusing your energy on as you push the business forward?
So I early on had basically a decision where I was like, okay, do I hire a CEO and basically become the CTO, or will I kind of like keep the CEO role? I believe while initially I was like, well, it doesn't like seem too bad to just be able to focus on like building the product and like do that, but I realized very early on that the CEO will kind of like decide the direction of the company and what its incentives are and where the product will eventually head. And I had a very clear picture of what I want Wonderland Engine to become, and kind of that clarity is a very long-term picture that would I like you would need to find a very specific person that is basically like a copy of that to like be able to say, yep, I'll just fully trust that guy to implement exactly that vision and not get like distracted by potential like short-term other opportunities. So I think I for me I just decided like I believe that it is also important that a developer focused product is led by a developer who understands what developers are looking for. Um, I, I don't know, hinting at some companies where this is not the case. You see that sometimes doesn't quite work out. But yeah, so um, my time at the moment, coming back around to your question, is mostly spent on like representing the company to the outside, whether that's like potential customers or investors, or uh, generally trying to like fill in also the under resourced parts of the company, which like for example we have an immensely great developer team, like absolutely like first class developers with an insane developer workflow, where like we didn't just optimize the editor but also the way that we work to be able to release faster and like to make sure we make less mistakes, because I believe that developers software, like software that other developers build on, needs to be super stable, and kind of like having to adapt to new versions of the software and like potential breakage or new bugs is one of the worst things for like developer workflow. So I believe we need to shield like users of Wonderland Engine from all of that and just have them be or allow them to upgrade to the next version with like a calm kind of like attitude and just be like, well, I know that my project's gonna load, nothing's gonna break, it's just gonna work out of the box. I believe that's also something that sets us apart from a lot of like other engines. But like coming back, so it's like developers, we have a lot that are doing an amazing job, and so like my resources as like a very general purpose like guy in the business, being able to fit into every role, um, I probably not as useful there at the moment. Um, so I'm just trying to fill in basically all the areas where we do not have someone who's specifically doing that, and then trying to kind of like balance out the resources in that way.
So it seems like there, repeat back what I'm hearing a little bit, there's kind of three main focal points for you as a leader. One is vision and like strategic thinking. Like you have this very clear picture of what you want the company to be, where you want to go. And so thinking about the strategy of from where you are today to that vision, that's like number one. And I can definitely understand why that would be challenging to trust someone else with that. It's almost like being a creative director or film director. It's like you have this vision in your head. I always use the film director analogy because I was a filmmaker for a long time and an actor and all that, so it's just very relevant to me. But like you have a cinematographer that you can trust with the camera settings, and you have a lighting guy that you can trust with the lighting. But at the end of the day, when you look at that monitor and you see what it looks like, you see something in your head, and is it matching what's in your head or not? And how can you communicate that vision to the rest of the group to make their adjustments and their specialties to make that monitor show you something that looks like what's in your head? And I think with film, part of why I go to that analogy too is it's just very tangible. Like it's literally looking at a window into an actual visual of what might be in your head. So it's a little bit more direct. With you, it's similar, but it's like a development team that specializes in developing certain parts of the engine, and it's that communication strategy. It's these different pieces of a business to be able to get the company to provide the value you want it to provide. The second piece would be the external communications. So like representing the company, telling the story of the company to third parties, to outside potential partners, developers, and so on. And then the last piece is almost like just plugging holes. Every startup has a million fires. You're out here with a fire extinguisher, just trying to put stuff out wherever you can. So it seems like that would be like the big three is kind of what I'm hearing. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Awesome.
I yeah, I mean, like you said, every startup has holes somewhere. I heard somewhere that, and I won't get the quote right, so I'm very wildly paraphrasing here, but I heard somewhere that as a founder, you get to decide which problems a company has. Whereas, like, when I was still working kind of like as a job, it was like I was always seeing these things like going wrong with a company, and like I was like, I would never do it this way if I would found my own company. But effectively, you cannot build a company that is like perfect, as in everything just goes absolutely flawless. There's literally nothing you can complain about. The only thing you can decide is which areas really just like work extremely well.
Where it typically goes wrong is stretching too thin and trying to be like, we want to
Yeah.
solve all the problems, and then you don't end up getting any one or two of those things really perfect. And that's a really tricky thing to be able to manage. I am realizing it with time. I've got to run here pretty soon, but I want to give you a chance to tell people like where they can find you, if there's anything you want to plug on upcoming announcements, like where can people follow and learn more about Wonderland?
We'll be at GDC with a German pavilion, and so if you're there or in San Francisco, make sure to stop by, say hi, drop a message on LinkedIn to figure out how to meet. Um, on Definitely follow us on LinkedIn, Wonderland. You'll find it. Development platform for VR, AR, and 3D on the web, and then wonderlandengine.com, all together, no dash, no anything. It's just wonderlandengine.com. Is our official website. You can download Wonderland Engine for free, try it out, and make sure to join the Discord server if you do, because we have an amazing community that is welcoming of everyone who's coming, and will link you the right places to go to get started really quickly.
Amazing. We'll put those in the description so they're super easy for everyone to find. But Jonathan, I gotta say, I mean, this is only like our third time chatting, but I love your story, the energy you bring to the space. And again, I really admire the ambition. You're going after a really big undertaking. Engine level problems and developing an engine level product is probably one of the hardest things that anyone could do. And so with the feedback you're getting and the community you're developing, it's a real incredible accomplishment how far you've already come. And I'm super excited to follow the journey and see where you take this thing. Otherwise, that's
Thanks
the
so
plan.
much for the opportunity, Ricky. Had a blast.